Read in a retro style so old people can understand. The 70s were a rough road for American cars. Gas was scarce, rules were changing fast, and the old muscle magic was fading away. In the middle of all that, some models rolled out that looked fine in the showroom but fell apart once real life began. They were slow, clumsy, or just plain unlucky, the kind of cars mechanics still laugh about today. Here's a quick look back at the ones that truly missed the mark. The 1971 Ford Pinto is one of those cars whose story begins with optimism and ends with a grim kind of folklore. When it first arrived, it looked like exactly what America thought it needed at the dawn of the 70s, a small, affordable, lightweight runabout that seemed cheerful and uncomplicated. It was the kind of car a young couple would buy as their first new vehicle, or the kind a college student would choose because the payments were low and the gas mileage was high. Dealers displayed them proudly in bright colors, orange, lime, sky blue, hoping to convince buyers that small could also be fun. For a short while, it worked. Many families genuinely liked the Pinto's simplicity. It felt modern, friendly, even stylish, in a modest way. But underneath that cheerful face was a flaw so severe it would overshadow every good intention Ford had poured into the project. In rushing to bring a subcompact to the market and compete with the growing wave of imported cars, the engineers had to make compromises. One of those compromises was the placement of the fuel tank. Instead of being tucked safely between the rear axle and the seats, it sat dangerously close to the thin rear bumper, just a few inches from harm's way. A moderate tap from behind, the sort of bump that should have left nothing more than a dented license plate frame, could rupture the tank, causing fuel to spill and ignite. What should have been a harmless fender bender could become a fireball in seconds. People who drove the Pinto in those early years often talk about how they slowly learned to compensate for the car's weakness, even before the newspapers caught wind of the problem. Some say they noticed how light and hollow the rear of the car felt, as if there wasn't much standing between the trunk and the passenger seat. Others recall how mechanics quietly warned them to get the fuel lines inspected more often than usual. But the most vivid memories come from everyday driving, sitting at a red light, glancing nervously into the rearview mirror, hoping the car behind would slow down in time. Parents with children in the back seat would instinctively keep a little extra distance ahead to avoid sudden stops. Commuters learned to pull into the right lane so fewer cars lined up directly behind them. The Pinto subtly changed driving habits, as if all its owners shared a silent agreement to stay out of danger's way. The controversy eventually grew into something much bigger than just an automotive defect. It became a national discussion about safety, responsibility, and what it meant for a giant company to weigh costs against human lives. Stories circulated, some exaggerated, some painfully real, about accidents that turned from minor impacts into tragedies. Court cases emerged. Investigations dug into Ford's internal communication, revealing how quickly and cheaply the flaw might have been fixed, and how those fixes were delayed or dismissed. The Pinto went from being a friendly little economy car to a symbol of corporate negligence that echoed far beyond the automotive world. Yet for all the fear and anger surrounding the Pinto, many owners still remember the car with a mix of affection and unease. It was inexpensive to run, easy to park, and simple to maintain.
Teenagers drove them as their first cars. Couples took weekend trips in them, and countless Americans learned to shift gears behind that small vinyl-wrapped steering wheel. The problem wasn't that the Pinto was entirely bad. It was that one flaw, hidden and severe, overshadowed everything else about it. Even today, former owners tell stories that blend nostalgia with tension, like recalling a beloved yet unpredictable relative. One man described it as a car you liked until you remembered what it could do to you, while another joked that his Pinto ran on gasoline and prayers. Looking back, the 1971 Ford Pinto stands as a cautionary tale, a reminder that even a small, well-meaning car can become infamous if the wrong corner is cut in the wrong place. It's a car forever frozen in American memory, bright on the outside, troubling underneath, and unforgettable for the way it changed both the auto industry and the public's trust. Despite its charm, despite its affordability, the Pinto remains one of the clearest examples of how a single design decision can shape a vehicle's entire legacy. It is remembered not for how it looked or how it drove, but for the feeling it gave its passengers every time they stopped at a light and checked their mirrors, hoping the story wouldn't end the way the headlines warned it might.
The 1974 Ford Mustang II is one of those cars that older drivers still talk about with a long sigh, the kind you hear from someone remembering something that should have been great, but never quite lived up to its own poster. When it first appeared, the world around it had changed almost overnight. Gas prices had jumped, insurance companies punished every horsepower they could find, and new emissions rules strangled even the strongest engines into wheezing shadows of their former selves. Ford found itself standing at a crossroads. Keep building the big, thirsty Mustangs of the late 60s and early 70s, or reinvent the Mustang entirely. They chose reinvention, but in doing so, they created a car that looked like a Mustang from a distance, yet felt strangely hollow when you got close. To many buyers walking into showrooms in 1974, the Mustang II must have seemed like a familiar face. The badge was still the same galloping horse everyone knew. The proportions tried to echo the original, a nose longer than it needed to be, a rear that tucked inward gently, and a roofline that leaned forward with a hint of speed. But once you stepped closer, the illusion faded. The chrome trim was thin, the metal felt lighter, and when you tapped a fender with your fingers, the sound it made didn't whisper performance, it whispered compromise. And when you opened the door and sat down inside, the truth became impossible to ignore. The plastics were brittle. The vinyl seats felt as stiff as a church pew. And the dashboard looked like something designed more for budget economy cars than for the heir to a legend. Some owners joke that the interior wasn't built so much as assembled from whatever parts Ford had left over in the warehouse. But the real disappointment didn't hit until you turned key. Early Mustang IIs often came with the tiny 2.3-liter four-cylinder engine. The poor little motor tried its best, but pushing around the weight of the car made it pant like an exhausted dog. It rattled when cold, buzzed noisily when warm, and produced so little power that merging onto the highway felt like an act of faith. Even the optional V6 struggled, and when Ford added a 302 V8 later on, it sounded promising, until you realized it had been strangled by emissions equipment so badly that it produced less spirit than some six-cylinders from the previous decade. Drivers used to the roar of the classic Mustang V8 now found themselves listening to a muffled groan that never quite turned into a growl. People who bought the car expecting excitement were often left scratching their heads. One old owner remembers taking a friend for a ride, stepping on the gas to show off his new Mustang, and watching the speedometer climb with all the enthusiasm of a tired mule. The friend looked over and said, "Is it supposed to feel like that?" And the owner, embarrassed, changed the subject. This was the pattern for many buyers: hope on the showroom floor, excuses on the road. They expected a fiery young lion. What they got was a polite, slightly nervous house cat. Handling offered its own surprises. The suspension was soft and cautious, designed for comfort rather than cornering. On curvy roads, the Mustang II leaned like an old rowboat drifting toward the shoreline. The steering felt vague, as if the front wheels were connected by a long rubber band rather than a solid column. And the brakes, while adequate, didn't inspire confidence when the car was pushed even a little harder than normal. Some owners say that driving a Mustang too fast felt like asking it to do something it didn't believe in. It was a car that wanted to cruise, not to play. Yet, despite the criticism, and there was plenty, the Mustang II did keep the name alive. In a time when performance cars were dropping like flies, when big V8s were being strangled by regulations, and when many models vanished entirely, Ford managed to keep the Mustang on the streets. For all its flaws, the Mustang II bridged the gap between the muscle era and the rebirth of American performance later in the decade. Without it, there might not have been a Mustang LX 5.0, or a Fox body revival, or even the modern Mustangs people enjoy today. Still, history hasn't been kind to the Mustang II, and older drivers who lived through that era remember it as the moment when Ford reached for the stars, but only grabbed a handful of dust. It wasn't a bad idea. It was simply a victim of its time. A car designed during a shortage of fuel, hope, and horsepower. People look at photos of it now and think it was trying so hard, and in a way, that's the perfect summary. It wanted to be bold, but the world demanded caution. It wanted to roar, but regulations forced it to whisper. It carried a legendary name, but couldn't carry the weight that came with it. The 1974 Mustang II remains a bittersweet chapter in automotive memory. A car that tried to wear a hero's cape, only to discover it had been sewn from thin cloth. And yet, for all its shortcomings, it stands today as a reminder that even icons must sometimes survive the hard years to shine again.
The 1976 Chevette is one of those cars that older drivers remember not because it thrilled them, but because it became part of the background noise of everyday American life. It was everywhere for a time, in grocery store parking lots, outside factories at shift change, lined up at community colleges, and rusting gently behind apartment complexes. It wasn't a car you dreamed about or saved up for. It was a car you ended up with, cheap to buy, cheap to run, and just decent enough to get you to work. Yet under all that practicality, it carried flaws so memorable that anyone who owned one can recall the experience as vividly as the scent of gasoline on a cold morning. When Chevrolet introduced the Chevette, the company wanted desperately to slow the rise of fuel-efficient imports that were suddenly eating up the American market. The plan was simple: build something small, simple, and affordable. Unfortunately, the Chevette was exactly that, but nothing more. People often talk about how the first impression of a car can enchant you, how it can make you smile or stir your imagination. The Chevette did none of that. When you walked up to it, the thin metal panels flexed slightly under your hand. The paint looked dull even when new, and the chrome trim was little more than shiny tape. And the doors, older drivers still laugh about this, shut with a sound that reminded them of dropping an empty lunchbox on the floor. Starting the 1976 Chevette was its own ritual.
The tiny four-cylinder engine coughed awake like a smoker in winter, clattering and rattling until it found a rhythm somewhere between a sewing machine and a kitchen blender. At idle, the whole car trembled. You could see the hood vibrating, the side mirrors quivering, and the steering wheel shivering in your hands. If you turned on the heater at the same time, the fan added a dry whirring noise that sounded almost apologetic, like it regretted being part of the machinery. Owners often remember thinking, "This car is running as fast as it can, and it's not even moving yet." Out on the road, the Chevette demanded patience. It struggled up hills so slowly that drivers behind it sometimes leaned forward in their seats as if trying to help push it along. Passing required a quarter-mile of flat road, clear weather, and a little courage. The engine protested loudly whenever asked for anything more than gentle cruising, making a strained buzzing sound that felt like a mechanical plea for mercy. A fully loaded Chevette, 2 adults, a couple of grocery bags, maybe a dog in the back, felt as if it was carrying a piano uphill. Owners swear the car slowed down when facing a stiff breeze. Inside the cabin, things got even more memorable. The seats were thin enough that you could feel the frame underneath, and they wobbled on their tracks with every turn. Drivers found themselves sliding half an inch left or right whenever they hit a bump. The carpet was barely more than felt glued to the floor, and the dashboard plastics faded into a chalky gray after just a few summers. The glove box latch had a habit of letting go on its own, spilling registration papers onto the passenger's feet. But the most unforgettable detail, the one older owners mention with a half smile, was the smell. On hot days, the interior of a Chevette heated up like a tin shed in the sun. The plastic dashboard softened slightly, releasing a warm, sharp odor that mixed with vinyl fumes to create a scent many still recall, something between melting crayons and overheated electronics. Stepping into a Chevette in July felt like opening the door to a toaster oven. Some owners even kept a small towel on the seat so the vinyl wouldn't burn the backs of their legs. Despite all this, the Chevette had one saving grace. It simply refused to quit. Mechanics often said the car was so basic that there was nothing complicated enough inside it to break permanently. You could run it low on oil, let the paint peel, ignore every maintenance schedule, and it would still drag itself down the road like a loyal but exhausted old mule. Teenagers repeatedly stalled them, first-time drivers rode the clutch into dust, and families overloaded them with luggage for road trips. The Chevette groaned, shook, rattled, and complained, but it kept going long after anyone expected. For many Americans, the Chevette became a rite of passage. It was a first car, a commuter car, a hand-me-down from an older sibling who didn't want it anymore. It taught patience. It taught humility. It taught drivers to plan their acceleration far in advance. Even people who hated their Chevette admit it was a dependable little survivor, a cheap, humming, buzzing appliance on wheels that did its job without charm, grace, or pride, but with a stubborn determination that almost made you respect it. Today, when older drivers talk about the Chevette, they don't speak with anger. They laugh. They shake their heads. They remember the wobbly seats, the rattling engine, the cardboard-thin interior, and that unforgettable smell of hot plastic on summer afternoons. It wasn't a great car, not by a long shot, but it was a part of life. A humble little machine that carried people through hard times and long commutes. The Chevette never aimed to be legendary. It aimed to be cheap. And in that mission, at least, it succeeded completely. The 1971 AMC Gremlin was the kind of car that could only have come from a company fighting with every ounce of creativity it had left.
AMC was the smallest of the American automakers, and when the early 70s rolled in with rising fuel concerns and a wave of small imports flooding the market, they didn't have the time, money, or luxury to sketch a whole new compact from scratch. So they did something bold, almost reckless. They took their existing Hornet sedan, marched it into the design studio, and chopped more than a foot off the back. What rolled out of that decision was a car that looked like it had been designed on a Friday afternoon 5 minutes before quitting time. It wasn't sleek, it wasn't elegant, and it certainly wasn't subtle. But it was unforgettable. The Gremlin's profile became its signature: a long hood, a 2-door cabin, and a rear end that simply stopped, as if the pencil ran off the page. To some buyers, that abrupt shape felt fun and cheeky, like a mischievous cartoon character wearing too small shoes. But for others, the design was downright baffling. Many people swore it looked like a normal car that had been rear-ended by a train and never quite recovered. Parking lots turned into little stages where strangers would slow their stride, tilt their heads, and quietly ask, "What on earth is that?" And the funny thing was, the Gremlin seemed to enjoy that attention in its own unintentional way. It wasn't trying to impress anyone. It existed simply because AMC needed something small and different is exactly what they built. Inside, the Gremlin felt like someone had raided the parts bin with a stopwatch in hand. The dashboard was plain, the knobs were basic, and the plastics were firm enough to double as construction material. The seats were thin and sometimes crooked, the carpeting was an afterthought, and the door panels rattled if you slammed them too hard. But if you asked AMC engineers, they'd tell you proudly that this was the point. This was meant to be the American economy car for real, everyday drivers, something that didn't dress itself up with fake wood trim or tacky chrome. It was honest, it was simple, and it was cheap. But the simplicity came with quirks, many of them unintentional. Build quality varied wildly from car to car. One owner might get a Gremlin that ran smoothly for years and only squeaked on cold mornings. Another owner might get one that shook on the highway, vibrated at idle, and developed new noises every month like a mechanical calendar. The steering was particularly unpredictable. Some cars responded sharply, while others had enough play in the wheel that you could turn it a few inches before the car decided to participate. Highway driving could feel steady one moment and slightly adventurous the next, especially if wind was involved. And oh, the wind. Ask anyone who drove a Gremlin on an open highway during a breezy day, and you'll get the same story. The moment a crosswind hit that tall, flat rear panel, the whole car shuddered and nudged sideways like a skittish pony. One former owner described it best. "I wasn't driving the Gremlin and I were negotiating." Another said the car felt like it had personal opinions on which lane it preferred, and he was only there to offer suggestions. The lighter models with 6-cylinder engines especially felt like they were trying to escape the wind rather than push through it. Yet despite all its flaws, despite the buzzing panels, the wandering steering, the wind sensitivity, the economy car interior, the Gremlin had a certain spirit to it. It was the underdog car during an era when bigger, richer companies were rolling out polished machines with huge advertising budgets. The Gremlin didn't have that. All it had was personality. It was quirky, unapologetically odd, and somehow charming in a way no focus group could ever predict. People who owned one often look back with a mixture of frustration and fondness because the car was never boring. Every drive was a little story. Every strange sound was a mystery to solve. Every windy day felt like surviving a tiny adventure.
In the end, the 1971 AMC Gremlin became one of those cars that people remember not because it was great, but because it was distinct. It stood out in traffic, it stood out at gas stations, it stood out in memories. And decades after AMC faded into history, the Gremlin still pops up in conversations, always sparking a smile, a laugh, or a raised eyebrow. It was a flawed creation, but it was also a car with soul, born from a company that refused to give up. And maybe that's why it's still talked about today, because it dared to be different at a time when different was risky, and somehow that bravery made it unforgettable.
The 1977 Dodge Aspen and its Plymouth Valere sibling are remembered today not for charm, style, or performance, but for a reputation that haunted owners from the very first mile, a knack for falling apart almost as soon as they left the dealership. Chrysler had designed these compact sedans to compete with the growing wave of imports, promising reliability, comfort, and efficiency in a market increasingly concerned about gas mileage. On paper, they looked competent enough. Conservative lines, decent interiors, and a choice of engines that seemed sufficient for ordinary driving. But reality quickly proved far less forgiving. Even brand new cars developed rust in places you wouldn't expect. Fenders, wheel wells, and lower door panels seemed to corrode within months, as if the metal itself had resigned to a short life. Owners recall seeing the first hints of bubbling paint almost immediately, and within a year the rust would spread like wildfire. It didn't matter if the car was garaged, waxed, or babied. The corrosion seemed almost inevitable. People began joking that if the car survived its first winter without rotting through, it deserved a medal. And the humor wasn't entirely idle. Some drivers reported that fenders would need patchwork before the first anniversary, and replacement panels were expensive and difficult to source. But rust was only the beginning. The suspension on both the Aspen and Valere developed a reputation for fragility. Ball joints, bushings, and control arms wore far faster than expected, and a long trip over uneven roads could produce squeaks, thumps, and wobbles that made the car feel perpetually unsteady. Drivers learned to treat speed bumps like negotiation exercises and potholes like minor obstacles in a treacherous game. And as if the body and suspension weren't enough to test patience, engines had a tendency to stall or hesitate under normal driving conditions. Carburetor issues, vacuum leaks, and electrical quirks meant that the car could sputter unexpectedly, leaving a driver stranded at the side of the road with a hood up and a sinking feeling in their chest. Despite all this, the Dodge Aspen and Plymouth Valere were designed to feel modern and attractive in the mid-70s. The interiors were roomy, controls were simple, and the cars offered a respectable ride on smooth pavement. Early advertisements highlighted comfort, fuel efficiency, and practicality. But for many owners, those selling points were drowned out by the constant need for repairs. Mechanic visits became routine, and repair bills added up faster than anyone anticipated. Some drivers would joke bitterly that the only part of the car guaranteed to last was the steering wheel. It would outlast rust, suspension collapse, and even engine quirks, a small consolation for the daily trials the rest of the vehicle inflicted.
The 1974 Cadillac V8-6-4 is one of those cars that engineers likely dreamed about late at night, imagining a world where fuel economy and luxury could coexist without compromise. Cadillac, ever the crown jewel of American automakers, wanted to prove that even the heaviest, most opulent vehicles could be smart, efficient, and forward-thinking. To achieve this, they introduced an early electronic system that could shut off cylinders when full power wasn't needed. The concept was revolutionary. A massive V8 could operate as a 6-cylinder or even 4-cylinder on light loads, saving fuel while still offering the smooth, powerful ride Cadillac owners expected. On paper, it was ingenious, a glimpse of what modern fuel-saving technologies would perfect decades later. But in practice, the system was a nightmare. Electronics in 1974 were far from reliable. Microprocessors were primitive, wiring was crude by modern standards, and the sensors required to tell the engine when to deactivate cylinders were temperamental at best. Owners found themselves facing an engine that could not make up its mind. One moment, it tried to be economical, shutting down cylinders with a soft, uneven lurch. The next moment, it decided it needed full power, firing all 8 cylinders in a burst that felt abrupt and unrefined. The car vibrated unpredictably, hesitated under acceleration, and sometimes stalled when the computer signals conflicted with the mechanical reality of the engine. Drivers who paid top dollar for Cadillac's hallmark smoothness were treated instead to a mechanical indecision that made every trip a guessing game. Mechanics and dealerships were equally perplexed. Servicing the V8-6-4 required understanding this early electronic system, which no one was truly trained for yet. Repairs were difficult, and the technology was not mature enough to diagnose consistently. Owners often complained that their cars ran differently each day, behaving well in one town and misfiring or hesitating in the next. A vehicle that should have embodied Cadillac luxury instead brought headaches, frustration, and, in some cases, embarrassment. Imagine gliding through a neighborhood in a top-of-the-line Cadillac only to have it stutter like a small, temperamental European sedan when someone glanced your way. The irony was almost tragic. Here was a Cadillac, a car meant to convey status, comfort, and smooth power, equipped with one of the most forward-thinking, fuel-saving ideas of its era, and yet the technology was so far ahead of its time that it was unusable. Owners had to choose between abandoning the system entirely, leaving the car in standard V8 mode, or accepting an unpredictable, inconsistent experience that could be dangerous if the engine refused to deliver power at a critical moment. Many felt cheated, having paid a premium for innovation that didn't work. In letters to Cadillac, in magazine reviews, and in countless conversations, the consensus was clear. The V8-6-4 was a car that promised brilliance, but delivered frustration. Yet, despite its failures, the 1974 Cadillac V8-6-4 remains a fascinating footnote in automotive history. It showed a level of ambition and creativity rare for the time, a glimpse of a future that cars would eventually reach with modern engine management systems. Owners who survived with one have stories that blend disbelief, exasperation, and nostalgia. One recalled, "It was supposed to be the smartest Cadillac ever, but I spent more time wondering which cylinders were firing than enjoying the ride." Another joked that it was like driving a luxury car with mood swings. One moment, it was polite and refined. The next moment, it was confused and lurching like it didn't know what it wanted to be. In the end, the 1974 Cadillac V8-6-4 is remembered not for elegance, power, or comfort, but for its audacious ambition and spectacular failure. It is a lesson in what happens when technology leaps ahead of reliability. A car that promised the future, but forced drivers to live in the frustration of the present.
Even today, it sparks curiosity, laughs, and admiration for daring to try something the world wasn't ready for. A true Cadillac of contradictions, remembered equally for brilliance and befuddlement.
The 1975 Chevrolet Monza arrived with big promises and a small, sleek body that suggested speed, agility, and modern style. On paper, it was meant to be Chevy's answer to the rising popularity of European and Japanese sporty compacts. The design was low, wide, and slightly wedge-shaped, giving it a visual punch that appealed to younger drivers who wanted something that looked fast, even if the fuel crisis had tempered expectations. But behind the carefully styled panels, the Monza hid a series of frustrations that would make even the most patient drivers groan. One of the most notorious issues was overheating. The engine compartments were cramped almost to the point of absurdity, leaving little room for airflow and making routine maintenance a nightmare. Under normal driving conditions, especially during summer months, the Monza's engines tended to run hotter than intended. Older owners still remember leaving a parking lot on a warm afternoon and watching the temperature gauge creep steadily upward, knowing the car was already testing the limits of its design. Radiators were often overworked, hoses expanded and cracked prematurely, and coolant systems seemed to require constant vigilance. A leisurely drive could turn into a tense monitoring session, with drivers periodically checking gauges, listening for strange hisses, and praying the car would make it home without blowing a head gasket. Mechanics, too, were acutely aware of the Monza's shortcomings. The engine bay was so cramped that even simple repairs became exercises in patience, dexterity, and sometimes humor. Spark plugs, in particular, became legendary for their difficulty. Some garages jokingly referred to the Monza as a magic car, because removing a single plug often required maneuvering arms and tools into impossible angles, sometimes resorting to makeshift extensions or inventive contortions just to reach the tiny threaded hole. Changing the oil or replacing belts was similarly frustrating. Every repair required careful planning, a lot of patience, and a sense of humor. Even routine maintenance didn't guarantee reliability. Many Monzas spent more time in the shop than on the road, returning for the same issues over and over. A car bought with enthusiasm could quickly turn into a series of trips back to the dealer, overheating, engine misfires, leaking hoses, electrical quirks, or stubborn carburetors that refused to behave. Some owners would joke that their Monza knew the route to the repair shop better than the route home, a wry nod to the car's habit of attracting problems like a magnet. Despite its sporting styling, the Monza's design compromised practicality. The tight engine bay meant that any repairs were laborious. The cooling system often struggled with heat, and early engines were sensitive to neglect or abuse. Some owners recall nervously monitoring every mile, knowing that pushing the car too hard could result in another trip to the dealer. Yet despite all these frustrations, the Monza retained a loyal following. Drivers who appreciated its styling, handling, or fuel economy often forgave or at least learned to live with its quirks. It became a car that demanded respect, patience, and creativity to maintain. Today, the 1975 Chevrolet Monza is remembered as a car of contrasts, sleek and sporty on the outside, fussy and fragile on the inside. It promised excitement, but delivered constant reminders of the limitations of its engineering. Owners reminisce about the sweat, the frustration, and sometimes the laughter it inspired. They recall the overheating engines, the impossibly tight spark plug access, and the long line of dealer visits with a mix of exasperation and nostalgia. The Monza was not a car for the faint-hearted. It was a car that tested patience as much as driving skill. A vivid example of style and ambition clashing with engineering reality. And in that, it has left an indelible mark on the memory of anyone who ever owned or repaired one. a small, sporty American car that demanded more than it should have, yet remains unforgettable for those who lived through it.
The 1973 Oldsmobile Omega was supposed to offer a taste of Oldsmobile refinement in a compact package. On paper, it promised style, comfort, and a hint of prestige without the bulk and expense of the full-size models. It shared its boons with other GM compacts like the Chevrolet Nova and Pontiac Ventura, borrowing platforms, engines, and suspensions. To casual observers, it looked respectable enough, a small, squared-off sedan or coupe with enough chrome and trim to signal its slightly higher status. But for owners, the Omega quickly revealed a series of problems that would overshadow any design intentions. Electrical issues were among the first frustrations. Dash lights flickered or went out entirely. Windshield wipers stopped mid-swipe, and electrical gremlins seemed to appear at random. Owners often joked that the Omega had a mind of its own and that the car would choose the most inconvenient time to turn off a light or cut power to a crucial component. Even simple tasks like replacing bulbs or fuses became frustrating as the wiring harnesses were cramped and delicate, prone to breaking or shorting if handled roughly. These problems made what should have been a comfortable, reliable car feel unpredictable and temperamental almost immediately. The suspension, too, left much to be desired. While the Omega borrowed components from larger GM models, the materials and design were lighter, cheaper, and less robust. Ball joints and bushings wore quickly, leaving the car prone to squeaks, clunks, and vague steering feel. Drivers found themselves constantly aware of the road beneath them, especially on rough or uneven pavement. Long drives could become fatiguing because the car refused to glide smoothly. It bounced and shimmied in ways that made it feel older than its years. Even routine maintenance didn't always restore the handling to factory standards, leaving owners with a car that seemed perpetually on the edge of wear. Braking performance was another sore point. The Omega's smaller brakes struggled under normal driving conditions, particularly when carrying passengers or cargo. Drivers reported spongy pedal feel, extended stopping distances, and occasional brake fade on longer descents. It was a car that looked capable from the outside, but demanded extra care and attention whenever slowing down. Many owners admitted that driving the Omega required a level of vigilance they hadn't anticipated when buying a slightly upgraded compact from Oldsmobile. Even the interior, while styled to suggest a higher trim level, failed to deliver long-term comfort. Seats sagged prematurely, vinyl and plastic components cracked or warped, and the trim lost its shine within months. Combined with the mechanical and electrical issues, the Omega gave owners a sense that it had been worn out before its time. Some joked that the only thing truly special about the Omega was the Oldsmobile badge on the grille, a symbol that promised prestige but didn't translate into performance, reliability, or durability. Despite these flaws, the 1973 Oldsmobile Omega still had its loyal fans. Some appreciated the slightly more upscale styling compared to its Chevrolet and Pontiac cousins, and a few tolerated the quirks in exchange for a quieter ride or marginally better interior appointments. But for most drivers, the car became a running joke, a vehicle that required constant attention and mechanical babysitting to remain usable. It was a reminder that sharing parts with cheaper models could save money, but it also meant that any weaknesses in the underlying platform were impossible to hide behind badges or trim. In retrospect, the 1973 Oldsmobile Omega remains a cautionary tale from a time when GM tried to extend its brand prestige into smaller segments without fully engineering for long-term durability.
Owners remember the flickering lights, the creaking suspension, the hesitant brakes, and the interior that aged far too quickly. They remember the frustration of realizing that what looked like a premium compact was, underneath, just another car struggling to survive in the cost-cutting world of 1970s General Motors. And yet, decades later, it still stands as a small, quiet emblem of the era. A car whose badge promised more than it ever delivered, leaving memories of charm, disappointment, and a little nostalgia mixed together.
The 1978 Lincoln Versailles is remembered today not as a triumph of American luxury, but as one of the most infamous examples of badge engineering gone wrong. Ford wanted a foothold in the small luxury car segment, hoping to lure customers who admired Cadillac's Fleetwood Seville and Eldorado, but weren't ready to spend top dollar. On paper, the Versailles looked the part. Polished chrome trim, plush interiors with velour or leather, deep carpeting, and all the luxury cues that Lincoln could offer. It was meant to feel sophisticated, refined, and distinctly Lincoln. But the reality was far less glamorous, and buyers quickly realized that the Versailles had little more in common with a true Lincoln than the grille and hood ornament. Underneath the heavy pile of trim, the Versailles was almost entirely a dressed-up Ford Granada. Its unibody structure, suspension, drivetrain, and even much of the dashboard were shared directly with the much cheaper, more ordinary Granada and Mercury Monarch. For buyers who expected a unique, high-end experience, the similarities were shocking. Many recalled moments of cognitive dissonance when a friend would recognize the car's Granada roots. Wait, you mean this Lincoln is basically a Granada? The revelation was a bitter pill for anyone who had paid a premium for a vehicle that promised exclusivity and status. Driving the Versailles reinforced the disappointment. It was heavy, sluggish, and overpowered by its own weight. Acceleration felt slow and lethargic, especially compared to Cadillac's offerings, which managed to combine comfort with reasonable performance. The V8, while smooth and reliable, couldn't mask the car's ponderous demeanor. Long highway stretches became exercises in patience, as the Versailles lumbered forward with a grace that felt more stately than exciting. Handling, though decent for a luxury sedan of the era, was soft to the point of floatiness, leaving the car with a planted but hesitant feel in corners. Older drivers still remember gripping the wheel on windy days, realizing that the car's bulk, combined with soft suspension, made lane changes and crosswinds more dramatic than anticipated. Inside, the car aimed to impress. And on first inspection, it often did. Plush seats, a full set of gauges, wood-like trim, and a velour or leather interior suggested comfort and luxury. But the illusion faded quickly when you realized that nearly every control, switch, and feature was shared with the Granada. The interior felt heavy and overstuffed rather than carefully crafted, a subtle reminder that Ford had prioritized appearance over originality. Even the soundproofing and ride, though respectable, could not fully disguise the fact that this was a luxury car built on a platform meant for a mid-size family sedan. Buyers quickly felt that they had been cheated. Dealers reported frustrated customers who had expected a small Lincoln with unique engineering and instead received a glorified Ford. The Versailles became emblematic of a broader problem in the late 1970s American luxury market, the reliance on badge engineering to cut costs while projecting an image of refinement. It was expensive, but it didn't deliver a commensurate experience. It was flashy, but it lacked authenticity. And it was heavy, but it never felt commanding on the road.
Despite these flaws, the Versailles remains a fascinating footnote in automotive history. It represents an era when American manufacturers struggled to balance cost, competition, and brand prestige, sometimes with spectacularly disappointing results. Owners today recall the car with a mixture of embarrassment, frustration, and a strange nostalgia, a memory of an ambitious idea executed poorly, a car that promised refinement and status but delivered a lesson in compromise. The 1978 Lincoln Versailles is remembered not as a classic of luxury, but as a cautionary tale, a beautifully trimmed car hiding a humble sedan beneath, a symbol of ambition undone by practicality and cost-cutting, and a reminder that sometimes a badge cannot mask the truth underneath.
The 1979 Chrysler Newport is one of those cars that perfectly illustrates how a once-respected brand can struggle under pressure. Chrysler was fighting for survival in the late 1970s, facing financial instability, rising fuel prices, and increasing competition from smaller, more efficient imports. The Newport was intended to be a reliable, full-size family car, a conservative choice for buyers who wanted traditional American comfort without the flash of a luxury model. On paper, it seemed sensible. Roomy interiors, big plush seats, a smooth ride, and classic Chrysler styling cues like a formal grille and long, squared-off body lines. But in reality, the Newport carried a host of issues that made ownership frustrating and disappointing. Under the hood, the engines were uninspiring. Standard 6- and 8-cylinder options delivered power that felt sluggish at best, especially for a car of its size. Drivers often complained that acceleration was labored, particularly when the car was fully loaded with passengers or luggage. The engines worked hard to move the heavy Newport, sometimes seeming to grunt and wheeze under the effort. On highways, merging and passing required careful planning, and the engine's reluctance combined with a soft, oversized body to make the car feel slow and unresponsive. For families hoping for reliable transportation with a touch of smooth cruising, the performance was often underwhelming. Build quality only compounded the problem. Doors frequently refused to line up perfectly, giving the car an unfinished, slightly crooked look straight out of the dealership. Dashboards developed cracks early, sometimes within months of purchase, and interior panels loosened or rattled, creating an ongoing chorus of minor annoyances. Trim pieces, molding, and even emblems showed signs of cheap materials or hasty assembly. Owners found themselves constantly adjusting or tightening loose components, or simply learning to live with the car's quirks. The transmission was another weak point. Chrysler's automatic gearboxes in the Newport felt lethargic, shifting slowly and sometimes harshly. Drivers often joked that the transmission seemed half asleep, taking its time to decide whether to downshift, upshift, or respond at all. On stop-and-go traffic, the car could lurch unpredictably, and hill starts became a careful exercise in patience. Even a smooth, easy cruise could be marred by a moment of delay as the transmission hesitated to engage fully. All these issues meant that many owners didn't stick with the Newport for long. Trade-ins within the first year were common, as buyers quickly realized that the car's style and size could not make up for its mechanical and build shortcomings. The Newport became a symbol of Chrysler's struggles, a visible example of a once great automaker trying to produce large sedans on a tight budget and under intense corporate pressure. Despite these flaws, some drivers appreciated the Newport's remaining virtues. Its ride, though soft and sluggish, could be comfortable on smooth roads.
The cabin was spacious, and the seats offered a level of comfort that still made it suitable for long drives. But these positives were overshadowed by the persistent frustrations: the weak engine, the sloppy assembly, the slow transmission, and the sense that the car might not hold up long term. Looking back, the 1979 Chrysler Newport is remembered as a car that tried to survive in a difficult era but fell short. It represents the challenges faced by American automakers during the late 1970s: financial strain, rising fuel concerns, and the pressure to deliver reliable vehicles on shrinking budgets. For older drivers who experienced it firsthand, the Newport is a memory tinged with exasperation. A large, stately sedan that looked respectable, promised comfort, but too often disappointed behind the doors. It remains a cautionary tale in automotive history, a reminder that even established names can falter when ambition and resources collide with harsh reality.